Welcome everyone. Great to see everyone attending the session this afternoon. We'll just give it a few moments. Hello everyone, thank you for joining. Welcome everybody to this afternoon session. We'll just let a few more people enter into the session this afternoon. Hope everyone's had a lovely afternoon. Still a few more coming in. We had a really well attended session this morning for leaders. So this session is more about people working in quality areas, more practical care, delivery of care. So welcome to all of you. There'll be lots of practical aspects about embedding spiritual care in this session. We might say a welcome and start, I think, if everyone's happy to do so. Yep, wonderful. Well, welcome everybody to today's, this afternoon session on spiritual care in aged care. I'd like to just hand over to Cynthia Payne, the CEO of ACQS, to provide our acknowledgement of country.
Hi, everybody, and a very warm welcome. We'll do a bit of introductions in the moment, but it is important that we start our session with acknowledgement, and in the spirit of reconciliation, Anchor Excellence and Meaningful Ageing Australia, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and I will add there, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today, no matter where you are around the country. A warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Well, we'd like to do a very brief introduction of who we are today presenting this session. I'll just explain who I am. My name is Rachel and I'm the CEO of Meaningful Ageing Australia. We're the peak body for spiritual care and aged care. And I come today with a background as a Masters of Ageing and working in and around the sector for many years. And I'd love to introduce our wonderful partners at Anchor Excellence. Firstly, Cynthia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody, a very warm welcome. You can read the little bit of the blurb about me. I think it would be fair to say that we've been long supporters of Meaningful Ageing Australia, and when the opportunity to support Rachel in this endeavour came about, we couldn't jump in fast enough. Just on my own personal perspective, a bit of a yogi, very interested to make sure that we are really bringing out all the diversity that's associated in spiritual care. So really pleased to be with you today. And I know when I hand to Irene, Irene equally has a very interesting and eclectic background in this space as well. So Irene, over to you.
Great, thanks Cynthia. Every time I do these sorts of introductions and it says I've been working in the aged care sector for over 20 years, I feel quite flattered. It's certainly well over 20 years, and every time I do this, Cynthia chuckles at me. But, you know, I've been in aged care since I graduated, basically, and I've loved it. I've had many opportunities within it. I come from a Christian background, so my perspective is slightly different to my co-presenters. And I think that really does express the diversity of Meaningful Ageing Australia. I was actually a board member of the body that formed Meaning Ageing Australia. So I feel that this is just done full circle. So I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
That is wonderful. Yes, we totally agree, Cynthia and Dr. Irene. So how about we get straight into things now, and let's put some context around you know, the sector and how that works with spiritual care. So I think that one's yours, Irene. Sorry.
No, I've got my hand up. Look, aged care is continually changing. And so when we talk about the context of aged care today, we've got to recognise the dynamism of the thing that we're talking about. It's certainly a very viable organism, and it's one that just keeps growing. But as fast as it's growing, it's changing. And that's why it's hard sometimes to keep up with what's current, what's evidence-based, and how we should be doing things in relation to spirituality and spiritual care. We do know some things though. This is drawn from ABS, the last census data, and also from journal articles and from my lived experience of working in aged care. We know that the people that we're caring for now are much older. People aren't coming in their 60s and 70s. They're coming more in the late 80s, even 90s, and into their hundreds to live in residential aged care. And because of the increased age, they are frailer physically. They have more things wrong with them, or they've got more comorbidities at any one time. And so the length of stay is much, much shorter. We know that the people are staying at home longer, enjoying living in their own home with the support of community packages. So what we're talking about today applies equally to the community setting. We know that people can remain at home on a level 4 package, quite unwell for some time before they actually require admission, or they may not in fact require admission. Sitting alongside all of that, we've got a great increase in the regulatory environment. And what that means is there are more rules and regulations around what we do and how we do it and what we should be doing. And we know that the regulator is the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. And we know that the regulatory environment for us at a minimum is defined in the aged care quality standards.
And Irene, I would kind of dovetail in behind there to, you know, broaden that context around the reform agenda. So 100% the regulatory environment is a driver, but if we hark back to the Royal Commission into Quality and Safety, one of the undeniable drivers is a flip towards a much more consumer-centric entire aged care system. I think it would be fair to say that there's been a fair bit of public criticism that historically aged care has been very provider-driven, and that as part of this reform agenda, we are seeing a real focus on a rights-based approach to aged care, as well as a more fuller understanding of what genuinely person-centred care means in all those contexts.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. I think the next slide is yours, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I guess, you know, we want to put some context around spirituality and spiritual care. And sometimes people are surprised when they hear about the word spiritual or spirituality, they might have a context that's very much affiliated to a faith or a religion. And in fact, in case that is one element, but spirituality is much broader than that. And so if we think about it in the context of how we create meaning, hope, purpose, and connection in our lives, that's really holistic. That's very much in line with what a lot of our aged care services are aiming to do. It's often what we have in our mission statements. But there's also a lot of research and knowledge and understanding as to how we can approach and create those environments. And that's really, I think, what we want to look at today when it's assigned to, you know, specific standards. So spirituality is really that holistic sense. It's integral to a consumer's well-being and quality of life. So it really does, you know, play into that element of, you know, consumer experience, customer experience, and very much those accreditation standards, as well as, I guess, that element of, you know, person-centered care. So it's really important. So thank you for coming along to learn more about it today. And following on from that, spiritual care is the care and services that are provided to a person that supports them to find meaning and purpose in life. And as the slide says there, it sounds simple, but translating that into specifics is what we're really going to look at today. But we certainly do know that spiritual care does have a focus, and that's come up a number of times when people have contacted our organisation. I know Anchor Excellence as well, indeed, and Dr. Irene will go into a little bit of detail about that. But people are, sometimes surprised if they come from a faith-based organisations where they've had some accreditation comments that have said, look, you haven't met everything. And sometimes that's more about that inclusion and diversity piece more than anything. So, that is part of the elements that we need to really deeply understand. And I think we've got some great answers for you in the next slides.
Over to you, Cynthia.
Sorry, we're kind of all dancing over each other. And I think that's a great backdrop, Rachel, to understanding, well, why do we want to focus on spiritual care? So we do know from that research that there is, without doubt, an increased outcomes for consumers in terms of their whole well-being. It is all about supporting that consumer's best life possible. So again, in that diversity, without it being limited to those traditional views, Rachel, that you talk about, it will help enable that stronger sense of connectedness, not only from a home care perspective, but also in a residential aged care perspective, and creating supports for community connectedness. So I'm talking about even the community of that particular service. Creates an opportunity for possibility. And I think that's a really important part. I think the words here are adventure. What is it that's going to be the great thing for you, your own individual circumstance of what creates meaning and a great life? And of course, as we know, as people are frailing, that issue of supporting people to have a great death, whatever that means to them, again, in this broad context, means that we can also support end of life. And I think when we touch on the standards, we'll see even in the consultation that is open at the moment on the draft standards, we do have a question mark, don't we, Rachel, about whether or not spiritual care should be called out specifically, or is it that it is very clear in a holistic approach to care that we are covering it off as an essential component of well-being, not just a traditional approach, I guess, of health and well-being being much more limited or more focused from a clinical perspective. So we want you to think quite broadly about spiritual care. And I think, Irene, when we have a look at our next model and we start unpacking, what does this mean for the consumer? So Kat, I'll get you to take us to the next slide. We've got a whole lot of reasons to bring that person to the centre of this focus.
We certainly have, Cynthia, and thank you for that. We talk a lot about the value of spiritual care for consumers or to a particular consumer. And in this context, we've got this very happy gentleman and he's happy because the staff have taken a very open and broad approach to what his spiritual care needs might be. And we know that in the past, we've been able to align spiritual care with a particular faith or a particular way of thinking. But it's much more than that. It's about diversity, and your home or services diversity suite of policies should embrace the very broad church that it is. The Commission talks a lot about special needs groups in relation to diversity, and each of those special needs groups will have their own expression of spiritual care. And as a bit of homework after this session, talk to your managers or jump online and Google special needs care. And there's 12, 13, 14 even now probably of groups, population groups, excuse me, that the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission have called special needs groups because they are very generally different to what Australian population, the homogeneity of what the Australian population used to once represent. So the value of spiritual care is individualistic. It's got to be specifically tailored for a person, not a group of people, but a single person in your care. And it has to reflect their needs, goals, and preferences related to spiritual care. So for this gentleman, the spiritual care that he's receiving, he's got an increased sense of well-being and he's much more resilient or stronger. He's got less anxiety, he's not depressed, and he's not lonely. He's got dignity and he's got choice and he's got control over those choices. He may or may not have brain disease such as dementia, but he's certainly able, with support, if he does have a brain disease, to live the best life he possibly can through spiritual care support. He will receive great support in palliating and the active part of dying, end-of-life care and active dying. Now, everybody's preferences for how that spiritual care is expressed in that vein are going to be different. Someone may have professed no faith all their life, but then suddenly would like to see somebody to have that aspect of their spiritual care addressed. Others might have a very strong faith and be very comfortable in the fact that they've had a good life and now they're entering another phase of life. They may believe in a life after death that doesn't actually fit with a Christian tradition. And that's got to be accepted and it's got to be encouraged and nurtured. And we know that if we get that part of it right, that person's going to have what Cynthia called a great death. We know that if someone is spiritually satisfied, it reduces a number of risk factors because they have a sense of contentment and a sense of wholeness about themselves. Spiritual care is about identifying the essence of that person, regardless of what background they come from, what preferences they may have about lifestyle. It's about accepting them as they are and knowing them deeply. Deeply know your consumer or your person, and you will get their spiritual care absolutely bang on. Thanks, Kat. So we're going to now have a look at the standards as they are now. And you'd all be aware, I guess, by now that there are some proposed new standards. There's 7 of them and 32 outcomes, which we're going to look at when we've gone through these standards, because we think it's important that everybody's aware of the consultation process and how everybody, it doesn't matter what level of staff you are, you can contribute to the consultation process. Everybody has a voice in this, including consumers, and that is very important. But we know currently we have 8 standards. We have consumer dignity and choice at the heart of the wheel, the hub of the wheel. Then we have ongoing assessment and planning with consumers as the second part of, I call this a pie, no disrespect meant. The third part of the pie is personal care and clinical care. The fourth part of the pie, or the fourth standard, are services and supports for daily living. The fifth element are organisations' service environment. The sixth part is how you can provide feedback or make a complaint without prejudice. The seventh piece of the puzzle are human resources. And of course, the eighth is organisational governance. Now, we need to be very clear about this wheel, this pie. It's like any cake you cut. You take one piece out and there's a very good chance it's all going to collapse on itself. If we remove just one piece of this wheel, or even 2 pieces, it's going to implode on itself. It's going to collapse. These are totally independent concepts and constructs, and they can only be seen as a whole, even though we have to meet particular criteria within each of the spokes of that hub. Thanks, Kath. So let's look firstly at standard 1, consumer dignity and choice, and how that relates to spiritual care for a consumer. We know that the consumer has certain rights, and Cynthia did talk about a rights-based approach. And they've got the right to exercise choice and their self-determination at all times about the type of spiritual care they receive and how it's delivered. They've got the right to practice self-determination and make choice about the type of spiritual care they want and about the spiritual practitioner of their choice. Now, it may not be a conventional minister of religion. It might, as Cynthia said, be a yogi. It could be a Buddhist monk. It could be another contemplative of some sort. It could be anybody, really. It could be an aromatherapist. It's whatever that person chooses. It could be a faith healer, for example. But that person has got the right to choose their own spiritual practitioner. And that choice has to be supported. You're their advocate, and part of your advocacy role is to make sure that they get the person of their choice to support their spiritual care needs. And they also have the right to pursue relationships of their own choice. You can't corral everybody into an activity, for example. They may not like the person either side of them. But what you can do is talk to them about who they would like to be with, how they would like to spend their time, how would they like to share their life with other people. And again, as an advocate and a facilitator of spiritual care, your role is to do that and get that happening for them. The organisation has got to ensure cultural safety, and I guess every organisation should have a cultural safety policy and process. And again, after the session, please go and see if you can find your organisation's policy and process, because that's going to give you the guidelines that will help you deliver and support better spiritual care. Again, privacy and confidentiality is absolutely paramount, and there should also be a policy and process around privacy, dignity and confidentiality. They'll also you'll have a vast array of policies and processes that cover just about anything you can think of that might occur in your service. They will all reflect some element that supports spirituality. Now, you might say to me, well, what's a maintenance program got to do with spiritual care? Okay, I can tell you straight out, if the maintenance program is responsible for the outdoors, for example, and there's seamless entry inside and outside of the service, then that policy and process supports the spiritual expression for that person if they're an outdoor person. And you also must have information about spiritual support available for consumers who may not be mainstream to regular denominational activity. Right, let's move on to Standard 2. And how does Standard 2, ongoing assessment and planning with consumers, actually relate to spiritual care? So again, let's have a look what the consumer's rights are. And so much of this is embedded in the Charter of Aged Care Rights, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. The consumer has the right to recognition that spirituality and spiritual care comes in many forms. And we've talked about some of these: art, music, yoga, rituals, dancing, singing, chanting, meditation, having great relationships with people. That is all spiritual care. Supporting critical life events. And I guess for a lot of people that have come into residential care from community care, it is absolutely catastrophic for some people. The grief and I guess the bereavement process that they go through, having given up, their home, their garden, everything that was them, the essence of themselves, they have to redefine themselves in terms of what spiritual care they're going to need for support. It's not a one-day conversation. It's not a one-hour conversation. It's an ongoing conversation for as long as you have that care relationship with that person. Birthdays, anniversary, feast days, all really important celebrations. Culturally appropriate assessments to identify choice and preference. And here we're talking about things in their own language, if they're from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. We're talking about making choices that are culturally appropriate for themselves. I know this Friday, and I can never pronounce it, but it's spelt QXI or OXI, most important Greek festival day of the year. We've just had Diwali. And these are all things you can celebrate, even if then people aren't particularly aligned to that way of thinking. It's an expression of celebration that you can invite people to share in. We talk about sensitive and meaningful end-of-life discussions. And again, this is not when you come in. I used to be horrified when, and I stopped doing it as a manager, asking people the moment they walk in the door, who's your funeral director? Okay. That's a conversation that you should have in the context of end-of-life discussions, which run over many weeks, many months, right up to the point where someone may be even actively dying. Some cultures will not even discuss it until they get to that point. So again, the deep knowledge of a consumer is actually what's going to put you on the map there. Supported decision-making. Look, you've got 3 levels of decision-making, as you know, in your services. You've got independent decision-making, where the person can make all their own decisions and be absolutely responsible for them. And then you've got supported decision-making, where, for example, on a good day, Cynthia can decide for herself what she'd like to wear or what she'd like to eat, but on a bad day, she can't. So you've got to help with those sorts of decisions. And then finally, you've got substitute decision-making, where Cynthia can't make any decisions anymore because of her cognitive impairment. Poor Cynthia. Anyway, and so she has a substitute decision maker who will come in and help make those decisions, including her in the conversation, but ultimately knowing and being aware that they are the ones that have to make the decision. Your role in terms of spiritual care is to support that process. Do not exclude the consumer from it. Okay, even if you know the consumer has no cognitive capacity to make decisions, they should be included in the decision-making process, because that is about their dignity and their choice. And we used to, co-design is not a term that's reflected in the new standards at all. Partnering in care is, or partners in care. And not so long ago, the Commission did launch a program. And again, if your service hasn't come across this, ask to see how the implementation process of that is going, because it is a fact of life and it has to be implemented. So the approved provider integrates spiritual care assessment with assessment policies and processes. We had quite a lengthy discussion this morning about the fact that electronic systems don't always do the spiritual care assessment process justice. That you need a standalone almost spiritual care assessment that you can integrate back into the system through progress notes and the care and service plan for that particular consumer, so that you do get the true essence of that person. I can guarantee you, if you capture the pure essence of that person in the care and service plan based on your spiritual care plan, that person will be much better off in terms of their well-being. You may need
Couldn't agree more.
Sorry, go Rachel.
No, I was just saying I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, those kind of tools, yeah, there's just a huge benefit that can happen through having those conversations and reacquainting with them through the journey of someone's aging. Thanks, Ian. Yep.
The only other thing, Irene, I'd add here before you make that last point is, I think with Standard 2, I think our frame of reference was very clinical at the very beginning of when these standards came. And I think that if we're bringing focus to spiritual care at this point to really widen our understanding and appreciation, the chances are that's also very relevant for the consumers themselves. So one of the things I like to always call out is we are generally dealing with such diverse communities, and there is not a consistent health literacy. So even navigating this conversation of assessment and planning is going to be an area of change as we all become much better at being able to bring this focus to that individual level. We have still historically been quite narrow in our focus. So if I just reflect on Standard 2, ongoing assessment and planning with consumers, coming off the back of we did things to consumers, now we're doing them with, and now we're moving to genuinely partnering, where the consumer is much more active in driving that component. It's subtle, but it's an important, I think, component to call out, because as part of that change management that's going on, there is a subtlety around how we approach these conversations. And again, that assessment and planning element of holistic care, bringing in that spiritual care focus.
That's right, Cynthia, and that's why we put the accredited interpreter up there, bearing in mind that, you know, the current, I guess, demography of a lot of older Australians is that many of them have a migrant background, and that was borne out in the last census also. And English might have been their third or fourth language. So as people age, as their cognitive capacity declines, people tend to revert to their first language. And so even though someone may have lived here for 40 or 50 years, 60 years even, they may revert to their first language. So you may need an accredited interpreter or the telephone interpreting service at some stage to support spiritual care needs. Again, just re-emphasise the role of the consumer, even if you think they can't make decisions in decision making. And you need to get consent from them before you think, oh, I might just call in a yogi because we know that this person would benefit from it. Okay, you need to have an informed discussion with that person and get consent for that to occur. When we look at standard 3, personal and clinical care, the consumer has got the right to spiritual care that reflects co-design and partnering in care. That's a given, and it runs through all the standards. So to do that, some tips: ensure spiritual preferences are facilitated and respected at all times. Ensure privacy and confidentiality are respected for that person. Don't share information that you don't need to share with external sources or other staff members, even if it doesn't concern them. Have active referral networks in place to a range of practitioners. It might be an aromatherapist, it might be a chaplain, might be a faith healer, might be a musician, could be a range of people that will come and provide spiritual support. And ensure consent is obtained for your spiritual care plan interventions. Now, this goes to the core of care and service planning, where if you decide together with the person or their substitute decision maker that this is a good intervention, or it's an intervention the person would benefit from, or that the person in fact chooses themselves, you need to ensure they've had enough information to give informed consent for that to occur. What you've got to bear in mind is that if Rachel agrees that I can go and call a yogi today, tomorrow she might say, I'm sorry, that was the wrong decision, and she can withdraw that consent at any time. Sorry, you're going to say something, Rachel?
Oh, apologies. I was just going to say, if people are looking for ways to kind of navigate that conversation, there is also a free assessment, a validated assessment tool. So it's got all the research behind it, and that's called Connect 2. If you ever, you know, if you're interested in having that dialogue and understanding, as Dr. Irene has just spoken about, is it nature that is, you know, the strongest thing that helps fill that person's well? Is it, you know, is it poetry? Is it reflections? Is it meditation? Is it faith? Caring for others? You know, that's got a really simple way of being able to kind of have that conversation, but also understand what it is for that individual person that will help them on their journey. And that can also help you, rather than waste money, if you like, on things that might just kind of entertain or provide you know, putting someone in front of the TV. At the worst case, I'm sure no one would do that here, but, you know, just putting someone in front of a TV to kind of entertain them, it really does look much more deeply into what is motivating that person, what is really important for them, and allows them to be able to kind of receive the types of activities that Irene was just talking about.
Mm. And before we leave standard 3, it's important to flag this is where specifically 3.3c, which picks up those needs, goals and preferences nearing end of life. So there is a specific focus here, and it's really important to reflect on the words recognised and addressed, and their comfort maximised and their dignity preserved. And the only way I think it would be fair, Irene, to harness that is you know, to go to your earlier point, you've really got to know that individual consumer as much as possible. It's not possible
Absolutely.
to actually answer that, even if you've got a stock standard approach to end of life or a palliation pathway. That's really not what we're harnessing here. It's also a deep understanding and dialogue with that person.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%, Cynthia, because deeply knowing the consumer takes a lot of anxiety away from both the consumer, but also the person that's delivering the care. Because there's a relationship there. It's a professional relationship, but it's also a friendship. And when someone does die, and I'm sure that, you know, we can all relate to this, if you've had a close relationship with someone and you've been doing very intimate care for that person, there's a very strong bond. And it's not uncommon to see staff, you know, actually grieve the loss of residents. And I think that that's something that we haven't always recognised, that the staff have spiritual care needs as well in relation to end-of-life care. Let's move on to standard 4, services and supports for daily living. Now, this is an interesting one because this covers activity programs as well as food and other ritualistic things. Can I please be straight up front here and say that spiritual care is not activities. It can be a part of activities, but it's not the activity program. And before we put this slide deck together, we did a review of quite a number of assessment visit reports from the Commission to pick up what they found about what the staff perceive spiritual care to be. And over and over again, the staff told the Commission auditors that it was about activity programs, or it was about taking someone to Mass or getting a priest to come. They had no concept about what spirituality was, and less of an idea about what spiritual care actually looked like on the ground. So in relation to services and supports for daily living, the consumer's got the right to make their own food choices. And if you've reviewed the dining experience material that's come out in the last couple of months, you'll know that that includes eating when they want to eat and eating what they want. So there's been a massive shift away from breakfast at 8 o'clock, lunchtime meal at 12 o'clock, and it's all done and dusted by 5:15. Okay, we can't do that anymore. And that's going to have an impact on a lot of other activities, operational activities within the home. People might fast as part of their spiritual expression, and that's got to be supported in line with their comorbidities. So we have to support people to fast within, I guess, certain restraints, but helping people understand that they still can fast, but it might just look a little different. Activities with spiritual meaning, church services, reminiscence, getting people to talk about themselves, their life review. Get them to tell you stories about them. These people have had amazing lives. You know, they've lived through wars, depressions, you name it. They've been there basically, especially the people in their, you know, their early hundreds. They've got the most amazing stories to share. And your own spirituality can only grow through being, you know, having empathy with those things. Photochronologies are great, and one of the things that I've found really helpful, I know particularly with my mum and dad, was we had boxes and boxes of photos, and I just sat with them over a fairly long period of time, a couple of months, and we went through and we actually put them into chronological order, and we wrote things about each of the photos, and they became very precious to my parents as they entered the final stages of their lives. Support for rituals, worship, sacraments, praying, meditation, chanting, worship supports around the home, their home if they're in the community or within their rooms, their own personal space, icons and crucifixes, and also readings from sacred texts, and of course recognition of special event days. as you put this into practice, you ensure spiritual needs and preferences are shared on a professional basis only. You know, if you think something's a bit out there, you don't go and talk about it over morning tea, right? If you need more clarification, you might go to your immediate line manager or talk to the resident. Ask the resident about it, right? Or the consumer. Get them to tell you why it's important to themselves, and that will help you understand them a lot better. Safe spaces where you can have private dining, for example, or you can sit in the garden with your family. Internal spaces, external spaces. Again, special event days. And one thing we've learned from COVID is it doesn't always have to be face-to-face. There's lots of technology available now for spiritual expression. You can get a yogi online, a priest, a minister, a faith healer. You can get so much support without having someone to come in if that's not possible at the time. So standard 5, the service environment. Okay, this is the standard that supports space and amenity for people to express their spiritual preferences. The environment has to have private visiting spaces, for example, and accommodate a sacred space that includes a quiet, reflective space. Some homes have gardens, quiet gardens, reflective gardens, where people can go and sit. Other places have a chapel, for example. Some people just have a favourite chair looking out a window, but whatever it is, our role is to accommodate that. Have a fantastic IT platform available so that family and friends, contacts, worship services, all these things can be brought into the home. We talked this morning too, specifically about a consumer's own living space and how important it was to them. And in this context, we're talking about the person's room, okay? We're not talking about all the common areas, we're talking about where this person actually lives and sleeps. And we have to make sure that that is a safe place for people and that their belongings are secure. Imagine if you had to move into one of those rooms that Cynthia is now living in, for example. Cynthia's moved from a house in the bush, almost in the bush anyway, 4 bedrooms, two lounge rooms, big kitchen, the swimming pool. And now Cynthia is in a room. She's been able to bring some of her favourite possessions with her. But can you imagine how she's feeling inside? Think about it in your own context. If it was me, I wouldn't know what to bring because I've got heaps of valuable things to me, probably no monetary value, but for me, they're important. So those things you've got to guarantee the security of those things for the people because they are symbols of their spiritual needs, goals, and preferences. Okay, standard 6. I better get a wriggle on here. Feedback and complaints. Without prejudice, the person, put very simply, has to feel comfortable to make complaints. But equally, you should celebrate it when they tell you how terrific you are, okay? And so to do that, you need to have a really culturally sensitive workforce, okay? And that means people, again, going back, I've said it about 6 times now, a deep understanding of that person, okay? What makes them them? Where have they come from? What have they been through? Are they political refugees? Are they economic refugees? Have they lived in Australia all their life? What's their cultural background? And again, you should have a policy and process in place about a feedback management mechanism that allows people to feel that they can make comment and not fear reprisal. And we talk here about open disclosure. Open disclosure is the open and honest discussions you have with people when something's gone wrong or something could have gone wrong. Standard 7, human resources. In a nutshell, what this is saying to us is that the staff have to have the right attitudes, the right knowledge, and the right skills to support culturally sensitive spiritual care. And that has to be led from the top, but also it's got to be organically driven by the majority of the staff, the carers, the registered nurses, so that the needs, goals and preferences are met and that spiritual practitioner input is appropriate for that person. And finally, standard 8, the organisational governance standard. There has to be a zero tolerance for a lack of support for a consumer's spiritual expression, regardless of what that is. Your home will have a clinical governance committee, and spiritual care should be reflected through the work of that governance committee. There should be a spiritual care policy and process. So another piece of homework, go and see if your service has got one. And if it hasn't, agitate to have one, please. Because it's only through that policy and process that you've got absolute remit to pursue an individual consumer's goals, needs and preferences in relation to spiritual care. And education. Talk to people, talk to them about spiritual care, tell them about what you've learned from this webinar, and go out and try and get them on the same page about cultural safety for consumers and spiritual care and services for consumers. So that's the standards that we have today. We now have a set of standards that have been put out. These are subject to consultation and they're the drafted new aged care quality standards. Instead of 8 standards, there are 7. The first is the consumer. I am valued and have choice over the life I lead. Standard 2 is about the organisation and it says I have confidence in my service provider. Standard 3 is care and services. My care is based around who I am and what's important to me. Standard 4 is about the environment and the person feels safe and supported where they live. Standard 5 is clinical care and the person gets the right clinical care for themselves. Standard 6 is about food and nutrition. Now this is interesting because it's been pulled out of all the other standards now and it stands alone. I enjoy tasty and nutritious food every day. Standard 7 is about the community and I contribute to the community that I live in. And this is where the partners in care bit sits because the partnership is for them to contribute to the life of the nursing home or the community service. And yeah, so that's the standards. I was just looking for the 8 standards. It just shows you how attuned you get. So let's have a quick look at these. Standard 1, the person. Now this has got 4 outcomes: person-centred care, dignity, respect and privacy, choice, independence and quality of life. Now, if we look in the context of spiritual care, there are certain things that pop out at us that we need to be aware of. First of all is diversity. And when we talk about diversity, we talk about how different everybody is that's living in the nursing home and how many different aspects and attitudes and thoughts that these people have. Inclusion. How do we include everybody into the home while retaining their own individual personhood? Relationships. People have got the right to have the relationships that they choose. Autonomy. They've got the right to make their own decisions. And they've got the right to exercise that decision making at whatever level they can. Put all that together in standard 1 and you've got the beginnings of spiritual care for a person. If we move on to standard 2, and this is a big one, there are 10 outcomes in this one. Partnering with older people, quality and safety culture, accountability and quality systems, risk management, incident management, feedback and complaint management, information management, workforce planning, human resource management, and emergency and disaster management. Again, words that embrace that in terms of spiritual care, diversity, consent, education, choice, autonomy, decision making, all about spiritual care. The third standard, the care and services standard, assessment and planning, delivery of care and services, communicating for safety and quality, and coordinating care services. Here we've got things like end-of-life care, active dying, the deterioration process, choice, care and service planning, including spiritual care plans, and referrals to spiritual practitioners, to name but a few. Standard 4, the environment. Environment and equipment at home, environment and equipment in a service environment, and infection prevention and control. Again, the same words bounce out at you: dignity, control, choice, consent, safety, quality, all part of spiritual care. Standard 5, clinical care. We've got clinical governance, preventing and controlling infection in clinical care, medication safety, comprehensive care, and care at the end of life. Again, the words diversity, inclusion, partners in care. There is so much consent, palliation. There are so many things in there, and having a great end of life, all about spiritual care. Standard 6, food and nutrition. We have got diverse palates in Australia. One thing migration positively, without question, did was, take us away from our meat and 3 veg every night. And that needs to be reflected in the food that we serve people, and the comfort and joy that brings, and the fulfillment that brings. And that's going to be through assessment of what they like, when they want to eat it, and the texture of their food. It doesn't take away from the taste. If it's done properly and it's done well, everybody can have an enjoyable dining experience. Again, it's about diversity, and it's about spiritual care practice as well. And again, it's about deeply knowing that person so that you can make that a reality for them. And then the residential community goes without saying, it's the embodiment of all of it. Now, there is no specific standard statement or outcome statement about spiritual care. But if we go back to the first one, about the person, if you know that person, you can build it in to the other standards. Now, I'm going to hand over to either Rachel or Cynthia to talk about the consultation process.
So we know that through the engagement hub, there is a mechanism to give feedback. And I know, Rachel, you're particularly keen to make sure that the voice of this particular aspect comes through. So are you providing an opportunity for people to leverage input through Meaningful Ageing Australia?
Look, I think that's a really important point, Cynthia. I think spiritual care is something that, it is based on choices. It is also based on all the things that, we've just gone through about, the changing nature of someone's needs, the diversity and inclusion. But spiritual care is kind of at the heart of it. And sometimes we do need to ensure that the Commission is very clear on how that is elucidated in feedback. And I think, we'd really encourage people to do that. What I will do is I'll make a commitment to put the link for everybody to come to look at our spiritual guidelines as well, to get some ideas on how to respond or inform on how to respond to those that feedback that the Commission is after. Yep, definitely.
So I think this is, sorry, Irene.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so when we kind of cap this focus, we can see the connection of this seminar. We've got leadership is always a key driver of change and is a real key to building, I guess, that focus of spiritual care. So we're hoping that today, for some of you, affirming information, for some of you, maybe challenging your previous concepts, and also thinking about your own organisations and maybe how well you're going at bringing this genuine person-centred approach to your model of care. It's important that there is an informed practice, which Rachel, you've just made reference. That's a great segue to the spiritual care guidelines. And those guidelines are so critical. I mean, in terms of informing practice, they're based on an evidence base, and we'd encourage you to embrace them. Yes, of course, you've got to have compliance considerations, but that's not the major driver. The major driver is this shift towards the system really centering on the older person and older people, and really building an aged care system that's fit for them. Many organisations purpose alignment, and you don't have to be a not-for-profit or a faith-based organisation to have very clear focus through your vision, mission and values around what it means to bring and embrace a genuine person-centred approach. Now, you've heard from Irene. Irene said, look, there's a few things you need to go hygiene check, and particularly on the governing side, what are the systems and processes? So we talk about organisations, how do you hardwire systems and processes, policies and procedures? And then how do you softwire? That's all about culture and practice, how we embrace those guidance materials into our practice. So please check you do have spiritual care policy and processes, clarity around diversity and inclusion, and I'm sure already you might even go back and revise some of those policies as you open up a broader consent construct. Critical to have a focus around end of life, particularly in that valuing the diversity of different expectations around end of life, either embracing, denying, or whatever it is that is appropriate for that person. How that connects to leisure and well-being without it necessarily being the activities program, and how it embeds in your whole care and services suite. And I think even, Irene, we didn't talk about ANAC, but I would even flag that with the Australian National, I'm talking Res Care now, aged care classification, this shift to really skilling up all of our direct care staff to better improve, again, that person-centred approach. You do need to think about your human resources, people capability, how you're supporting development, training and development for these concepts, and making sure that you've got that essential document control and, of course, education. And we will be providing you this slide deck. So I didn't say that at the very outset, and there will be a recording available. So if you'd like to use this as a backdrop to supporting your own team's understanding, we'll be providing that to you to kind of help you use that. Thanks, Kat. So I think, Irene, you and I, or even you, Rachel, we're all aligned on this. If you're going to have a change management program, it is absolutely critical that you take what we call a top-down approach, so really owning it from the governing body level down, but also lensing it from the bottom up. And as we know, the regulatory assessment process is at each consumer. So we want to be really clear how are all of those systems and processes trickling down to genuinely affecting that lived experience or the living experience of the older people that are receiving your services. And that comes from really, and I know, Irene, you've said this, but really deeply getting to know each other. Organisations, Rachel, that really embrace those concepts will be moving ahead of the next phase of the reform agenda. So not just rudimentarily working through assessment and planning, but really deeply unpacking those conversations and helping consumers understand why that's so important. You know, that I feel valued, that going to that new standard, we know it needs to be finalised, but you can see that shift kind of coming through. And just like anything to do with person-centred models of care, you do need to help to make that spiritual care accessible. So thinking about decision-making, are we supporting the consumer? Do we have a substitute decision maker? Remember, substitute decision makers, their role is to make the decisions as the consumer would for themselves. It's not about the substitute decision maker bringing in their own views of the decisions that they would apply for themselves. We're bringing it to the context of the older person, and I think we've made the point about that broad focus. Rachel, what else would you add about leadership and governance of spiritual care?
I think also, recognising that, you need to provide opportunities and time for people to to learn about spiritual care and be able to have the conversations with people, because sometimes it's not always innate to every team member entering into that sort of conversation with people. And I think, you know, the other element that we get a lot of feedback about is that having sometimes those dialogues with people actually has an ongoing benefit to the team themselves. So if you're talking to that person, whether it's in home care or in residential aged care, and you ask them about what deeply matters to them, somehow innately that also does offer a really good effect to the team member as well. So if we think about kind of how to create those environments that are positive for our team members, you know, spiritual care actually has a beautiful byproduct for not just the resident or the in-home care person. It actually benefits us all. And I think through the pandemic, that's something that really, you know, we've all become very acquainted with some of these kind of questions and existential, you know, issues that have come up and arisen. And it's a great opportunity now, including with the changes to the standards, to really embrace this fully and include spiritual care at the heart.
So I think the question now is to think about, well, what next? And I think, Rachel, it's really important that the participants in particular have a really understanding of what they can leverage from Meaningful Aging Australia. So, I know you're a bit cautious of not turning it into a sales speak, but it actually really is important that everybody knows what Meaningful Aging Australia is. And obviously you're a membership-based organisation, but you've got a plethora of resources. So can we get you to talk a bit more about, you know, the benefits of Meaningful Aging Australia?
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, I guess this is a time for me to not necessarily hide our light under our bushel. We do have lots of tools and resources. And one of the elements about the creation of that is that a lot of it has been co-designed. In fact, a majority of it, I would say, is all being co-designed with either, if it's a tool for a PCA to understand how to move from a task-based kind of interaction with a resident to becoming more heart-centered and asking them and getting to know about their spiritual needs, such as Meet a Cura, which is a fabulous app that we have. Those things are available through Meaningful Aging Australia, and that was designed with PCAs or PCWs. So the people who actually are at the on the floor interacting with all the people came together and designed that tool, and that was married with research. So in our organisation, we certainly have tools that will help with accreditation and all those things that we were talking about in terms of domains and understanding the guidance and the governance for leaders. We have communities of practice as well, because also it's a great opportunity for people to have, swap ideas, find new ways of fulfilling that mission of spiritual care and understanding it. And lots of tools and resources such as, micro-learning or education that we'll do face-to-face, as well as all the research that underpins that. So none of this comes from, us sitting around a table and deciding this is what should work. Much of this actually has a discipline that's embedded very deeply in research. And you can see there the organisations that we are affiliated and partners with in getting that research done. So thank you, Cynthia.
And in terms of where we can help, we've got a suite of policies and processes that will support your practice. So you need all of those best practice guidance materials and the other resources that Rachel said, but obviously we can come with some of that hardwiring component that might also. So I'm just going to come to the end. I think we haven't got any time for other questions, but I have noticed through the chat function, there are some links, and just be reassured that we will be sending you the slide deck. And if you want to access this webinar, it's complimentary. We encourage you to share that with your teams, particularly if you are coming up for a quality review or a site audit for reaccreditation, a great refresher to really cover over those standards and how spiritual care really is genuinely embedded in all of the standards. And you know, I think that's a really important component to reflect on if we're genuinely focused on understanding older people. We don't want to just have a standard on it. We want to really see it fully embraced in all areas, and hopefully even the touching of, you know, your flavour around what that consultation is on those new aged care standards. And I'll remind you that through Rachel, there is absolutely opportunity to express your view. You can also do it directly through the engagement hub. So any closing remarks, Irene and Rachel, and we'll come to a close.
No, look, thank everybody for, you know, coming along, and we've certainly enjoyed doing the 2 seminars that we've done today, and you know, we'll probably do some more in the future, I would think.
We'd love that too. And thanks so much for Anchor Excellence, I'm sorry, your absolutely wonderful support and interest engagement in today's session, and always being partners with us. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Dr. Irene, and thanks for everyone attending today.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.